The year was 1945. Europe was a continent unraveling. The Reich that had once promised 1,000 years now coughed and bled in its 12th. Snow fell dirty and slow over ruined German towns, clinging to the blackened ribs of bombed-out houses, melting into the mud where retreating boots had trampled hope thin. The Allies were closing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. 4 ordinary Germans, especially the young women conscripted into service, every dawn arrived with a question no one could answer. Who would reach them first? And what would happen when they did? Anna Weber had not imagined war this way when she'd been handed her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform. She was 22, once a student of literature in Berlin, quick with a smile and a secret love for American jazz records before the bans grew strict. Now she wore a gray-green jacket too big for her narrow shoulders and manned a switchboard in a makeshift bunker outside Koblenz. The days had blurred into one long static-filled transmission, artillery reports, frantic calls for supplies, commanders barking orders as the front lines dissolved. Her hands were raw from cold and from plugging cables in and out, but what hurt more was the silence of friends who'd gone east and never returned. Beside her sat Liesel Brandt, a farmer's daughter from Bavaria, cheeks hollowed by rationing but eyes still bright with stubbornness. Liesel was newer to this, drafted as the Reich scraped for any able hands to fill support roles. She joked sometimes to hide her fear, whispering to Anna that they were the last stitch in a uniform coming apart. But when the distant thunder of American artillery rolled closer each night, the jokes thinned out. Propaganda had promised them victory, then promised a heroic last stand, and now promised almost nothing at all. Posters still clung to walls, sharp-jawed soldiers staring east, slogans about defending the homeland, but the paper curled and tore in the damp. The truth was impossible to ignore. Trains no longer ran on time. Cities once proud and tidy now choked on rubble. Commanders abandoned posts without announcement. Even the radio, that once thunderous voice of the Reich, crackled with vague reports and hollow reassurances. People whispered instead, and what they whispered was defeat. Yet fear was not simple. It had layers. Anna feared the Soviets most. Everyone did. Stories seeped westward of retribution and chaos. Villages burned, civilians violated, whole columns of refugees swallowed by the red tide. But the Americans, they were rumor wrapped in contradictions. Some said they were brutal. Others said generous. Some said they were rich, chewing gum and tossing chocolate. Others claimed they were gangsters. Few had seen them up close. To Anna and Liesel, the Americans were shadows on the edge of maps. Foreign, unpredictable, but maybe less terrifying than what waited from the east. Their little unit, a tangle of phone lines and young women, was ordered to hold fast as the Wehrmacht pulled back. Communications are the veins of the army, a weary captain had told them before vanishing himself 2 nights later. When tanks no longer rumbled past and supply trucks failed to appear, the women were left with empty orders and a growing certainty. No one was coming to protect them. One night in March, the air raid sirens wailed half-heartedly. Then came a silence so deep it pressed on the eardrums. From the bunker's mouth, Anna and Liesel peered into a sky glowing faintly to the west. Fires marked where the front had collapsed. Somewhere beyond those flames, entire German divisions were surrendering without firing a shot. The Reich had become a shell, and inside that shell they were ghosts waiting to be found. Sleep was fractured, cold bunks, distant shelling, the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Anna clutched her mother's last letter, worn soft from rereading. "Stay safe, my little one. If the Americans come, remember you are not the enemy." Her mother had once hosted jazz nights before the Gestapo shut such gatherings down. Maybe that small rebellion had left her less afraid of foreigners. Anna wanted to believe her. By early April, rumors hardened into fact. American patrols were near. Columns of prisoners, men and women, were seen trudging west under white flags or bare hands raised. Anna's unit was ordered to relocate but had no transport. They were instructed to destroy sensitive equipment. Liesel yanked out wires with trembling hands. Anna hesitated before smashing a field telephone with the butt of an old rifle. It felt like breaking the last link to something solid. They packed what little they had, a few photographs, dry bread, canteens, scarves to ward off the cold. Then they waited. No one dared desert. There was nowhere safe to run. They huddled in the bunker doorway listening for engines. When the Americans arrived, it was not with the thunder of tanks or the icy discipline of Nazi parades. It was different. First came the rumble of jeeps over frozen earth, then the sound of voices, low, easy, punctuated with laughter that startled the women because it seemed almost casual. Anna stepped forward instinctively, heart pounding. She expected harsh shouts in a foreign tongue, perhaps rifles raised. Instead, a man in dusty olive drab leaned out of a jeep and tipped his helmet as though greeting neighbors. He was tall, sun-browned, with a grin that looked carved from another world entirely. Liesel whispered, "Are these Americans?" as if the word itself might break. The soldiers fanned out, careful but unhurried. Some had scarves tucked cowboy style under their jackets. One wore leather boots that seemed wrong for Europe's mud. Another chewed on something and spat calmly aside, as though this ruin was just another ranch road. Their rifles were slung loose, not menacing. They looked relaxed but alert, alive in a way the hollow-eyed German troops hadn't seemed in months. Anna felt the first crack in the wall of dread she'd built inside herself. These men did not carry the cold fanaticism of the SS, nor the vengeance-fueled fury she feared from the Soviets. They moved with an easy confidence, like men who trusted the ground under them. It was disorienting. A soldier approached slowly, hands visible. He spoke in English, then in halting German learned somewhere between Kansas and combat. "Krieg, over soon. You, safe." His accent was strange, broad, rolling. Another young GI tossed a packet of cigarettes toward the women. Liesel caught it clumsily, blinking at the bright American brand. No one had offered them kindness in years. The women were gathered, counted, their names taken. They were prisoners now, though the word felt odd. The air lacked menace. The Americans seemed almost bewildered to find a unit of female auxiliaries alone in a bunker. One laughed softly, not cruelly, shaking his head as if the absurdity of war had finally revealed itself. As they were loaded onto trucks, Anna studied the men. Some had bandanas knotted at their throats. One wore a battered Stetson tucked behind his seat. It struck her suddenly, these were the cowboys from half-remembered books, the wild riders from films she'd once glimpsed before the war swallowed youth. They were real, standing in the wreckage of her defeated nation, and they looked nothing like the monsters propaganda had painted. The road west jolted under the truck's wheels, past villages sagging under surrender. The women were silent, each locked in her own swirl of relief and confusion. Anna stared out at the fading Reich and wondered what it meant to be captured by men who seemed to come from another planet, a planet of open skies and untamed spaces. Liesel broke the silence with a whisper, "They're not like the ones we were told about." Anna nodded but kept her eyes on the horizon, where the sky widened beyond the smoke. Something was changing, not just the front lines but the story she'd been told all her life about enemies and saviors, strength and weakness. She clutched the side of the truck as it lurched, feeling the unfamiliar weight of hope and unease tangled together. She was a prisoner now, yes, but she was alive, and the faces of these Americans, these strange, easygoing cowboys in uniform, had already begun to erode the certainty of everything she'd believed about the world beyond Germany's walls. And yet, deep down, a question pulsed. Who were these men really, and what would it mean to fall into the hands of such unexpected captors? They had called them Americans, but to Anna and Liesel the men who rode into their ruined corner of Germany felt like something else entirely. The first morning in captivity brought light through mist, the smell of gasoline and damp earth, and the sound of boots crunching gravel. The guards who walked the perimeter of the makeshift camp were unlike any soldiers the women had known. Tall, broad-shouldered, sun-browned even in Europe's weak spring light. They moved with a loose, almost playful confidence that clashed with the brittle precision of the Wehrmacht. These were men who had come from another world, and, in a way, they had. Most were sons of the American West, a land so far from the Reich that it might as well have been a myth. They had grown up on ranches and in dusty towns where the horizon was a straight line of heat and sky. Many had known horses better than trucks, rifles better than textbooks. When war came, they'd answered quickly, some out of patriotism, some out of restlessness. Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, states few Germans could even point to on a map, sent thousands of young men across the Atlantic. The U.S. Army absorbed them into armored divisions, infantry regiments, and cavalry units now reimagined as mechanized thunder. But pieces of home clung to them. The tilt of a hat, the drawl that turned English into a slow, rolling music, the habit of standing wide as if bracing against prairie winds. Sergeant Jack Monroe was one of them. At 26 he had already broken wild mustangs, worked oil fields, and ridden rodeo for prize money. War, when it arrived, seemed another hard ride to survive. Jack's company had slogged from North Africa to Italy, then to France after D-Day. Now, in the spring of '45, he found himself guarding German prisoners in the Rhineland. He still wore his bandana tucked under his collar, not regulation, but no one bothered him about it anymore. The leather of his boots was cracked and dusty from years of service, but he kept them polished anyway. A man should look ready to ride, he'd tell his buddies, half a joke, half a creed. Beside him on perimeter watch that day was Private Tom Dusty Alvarez, a wiry New Mexican with quick hands and a quicker grin. Dusty had joined at 19 after a lifetime herding cattle with his brothers. Now he joked in a mix of Spanish and English, teaching anyone who'd listen a few desert slang words. To the German girls watching from behind barbed wire, the two men seemed relaxed, almost amiable. But their eyes missed nothing. They carried themselves with the quiet alertness of men who'd survived ambushes and shellfire and didn't plan to be surprised again. Anna observed them in silence. Fear lingered, but curiosity was winning inch by inch. These guards laughed easily but not cruelly. They shared cigarettes among themselves and sometimes with prisoners. One evening, she saw Monroe hand a chocolate bar through the wire to a shivering nurse who'd been crying. He didn't speak much, just a nod, a soft "here," the way a man might soothe a frightened horse. The gesture undid something tight inside Anna's chest. Liesel, bold as ever, tested the waters first. When Dusty passed by, she called softly, "Americaner?" He stopped, grinned and answered, "Ja, Americaner." Then, in accented German, "Kein problem." "No problem." She blinked, startled by his easy warmth. That night, the two women whispered about the guards' accents, their strange mix of ruggedness and kindness. "They look like movie heroes," Liesel murmured. Anna didn't disagree. Yet beneath the curiosity ran an undercurrent of tension. These men were conquerors after all, and the prisoners knew that every smile existed within an imbalance of power. Monroe felt it too. He didn't hate the Germans, he'd seen enough death to feel mostly weary. But he also hadn't forgotten the comrades lost at Anzio, the buddies buried in French fields. Trust was something he gave slowly, if at all. The Americans carried their culture like invisible banners. At night, when the camp quieted, someone would pull out a harmonica or strum a battered guitar. Swing tunes mixed with country ballads, a soundtrack utterly foreign to ears raised on marches and Wagner. Dusty taught the other guards to two-step in the mud. Their boots splashed, their laughter rolled across the wire. The German women watched, some bewildered, some enchanted. It was a sound no propaganda broadcast had prepared them for, joy that survived war. Anna felt herself pulled between two worlds, the rigid order she had served and this strange, loose-limbed freedom humming just beyond the fence. She thought of her father, a stern man who had once insisted that America was weak, decadent, unserious. Yet here were Americans, strong, calm, alive in a way that felt unbroken by ideology. She didn't know what to make of it. Monroe, meanwhile, found himself studying the prisoners more than he expected. He'd imagined hardened Nazis. Instead, he saw frightened girls barely older than his sisters. Some wore medals, but most seemed simply caught in history's machinery. One evening, he caught Anna's gaze across the yard. For a heartbeat they regarded each other. Wary, curious, two young people shaped by opposite worlds. He tipped his hat slightly, an old cowboy habit, then looked away before the moment could mean more than it should. Stories filtered through the camp about who these Americans were. Some prisoners whispered that cowboys were violent outlaws. Others insisted they were heroes from Western novels. When one guard lassoed a stray goat near the fence using a rope from his pack, laughter erupted from both sides, astonishment and delight mingling across the cultural chasm. It was a ridiculous, human moment, one Anna would never forget. But war's shadow remained. Each day more prisoners arrived and some bore terrible wounds. Trucks brought news of camps farther east liberated by the Allies, places whose names carried whispered horror. Monroe overheard rumors of what the Germans had done, and his face hardened in ways Anna couldn't read. The friendliness of the Cowboys coexisted with an unspoken gravity. They had seen too much to be naive. Still, small kindnesses built fragile bridges. When rations allowed, the Americans shared extra bread. They answered questions in broken German or gestures. Dusty showed Liesel how to whistle through her fingers, making her laugh for the first time since capture. Anna, shy but observant, memorized the strange rhythm of their speech, the way they spoke to each other like equals rather than ranks. Yet Monroe stayed cautious. One rainy evening, as Dusty joked with a group of prisoners, Jack murmured, "Don't forget, they wore that uniform." Dusty sobered but didn't stop smiling at the women. War had taught them both that humanity could flicker even between enemies, but also that trust was a currency spent carefully. For Anna, every day under their watch chipped away at the certainty she'd been fed, that Americans were crude invaders, that defeat meant humiliation without dignity. Instead, she saw men capable of power without cruelty, men whose ease seemed born of open land and self-reliance. It was unsettling, even thrilling. She caught herself wondering about the lives they'd left, Endless plains, wild horses, music without drums of war. As April deepened, the sense of waiting grew heavier. Everyone knew the war was ending. Rumors said Hitler was cornered in Berlin. Some prisoners whispered of going home soon, others feared Soviet transfer. Anna felt the world tipping but didn't know where she would land. One afternoon, Monroe rode shotgun on a supply jeep that rumbled past the fence. He glanced toward the women and, just for a heartbeat, locked eyes with Anna again. The look wasn't pity or triumph. It was something quieter, more complicated, a recognition that both of them were standing on history's fault line. She held his gaze until the jeep disappeared, heart thudding with a strange, new awareness. These men were not the monsters she'd been warned of. They were something far more dangerous to her old beliefs. They were human. And in that humanity, perhaps, lay a power she had yet to understand. Barbed wire sang faintly in the wind, a lonely metallic hum that seemed to divide whole worlds. Inside the perimeter, Anna stood among rows of women waiting to be processed, the cold biting through her thin uniform. The camp was little more than an improvised holding ground, wooden guard towers, muddy paths, and tents that sagged under early spring rain. Yet compared to the dread she had carried for months, it was strangely calm. No one shouted. No one raised a rifle. Still, the air trembled with the uncertainty of first contact, of old fears colliding with the living truth. The Americans moved among them with practiced rhythm, collecting names, checking papers, issuing rations. Jack Monroe walked his line with the quiet patience of someone used to handling restless horses. His boots squelched in the mud, his rifle resting easy against his shoulder. He paused at each group, speaking slowly in English, adding a few German words learned on the march. Name, rank, Arbeit. He pointed gently, showing with gestures when language failed. The women responded stiffly at first, voices small. Propaganda had promised humiliation and abuse. Their muscles braced for it. Yet the worst never came. Dusty Alvarez broke the tension with mischief. When one young prisoner struggled to understand, he pantomimed an exaggerated salute and grinned until she laughed in spite of herself. The sound startled everyone, a brief, bright note slicing through the gray. Soon others chuckled too, nervously but with relief. Dusty tipped an invisible hat, and Monroe gave him a look half stern, half amused. Even war, it seemed, could not strip humor from men raised on wide skies. Anna watched carefully, testing every gesture for hidden cruelty. She saw instead small signs of regard. A canteen passed to a coughing girl, a blanket tossed to someone shivering by the fence. When her own turn came, Monroe glanced at her papers and then at her face. For a moment his brown eyes lingered, not with threat, but with recognition, as if he saw a young woman rather than an enemy number. He nodded once and moved on, but the simple humanity of the moment rattled her. Liesel, always braver, began trading words with Dusty in halting German. He answered with a jumble of English and Spanish, teaching her to say, howdy, and laughing when she tried. At night she whispered translations to Anna. He says America is very big, that there are horses everywhere. Anna listened in silence, unwilling to admit how these fragments built strange pictures in her mind, endless plains, rivers without checkpoints, a life where laughter didn't feel like defiance. Life inside the camp remained harsh. Food was thin, cots cold, the future uncertain. Yet it was not the nightmare they had feared. Each small act of decency chipped away at years of indoctrination. The Reich had painted Americans as decadent, weak, even savage. Instead, these men were disciplined but warm, powerful but without the rigid cruelty Anna had known in German officers. It was disorienting to feel safer in defeat than she had in service. At night, when floodlights cut pale paths through fog, the women whispered about their captors. Some were skeptical, sure it was a trick. Others, especially the younger ones, were captivated. They smile, one said astonished. They share food. They look like those movie cowboys, another murmured, remembering contraband cinema glimpsed before the censors. For Anna, the shock ran deeper. If the enemy could be human, what had she been fighting for? Monroe felt the weight of those eyes on him. Guarding prisoners wasn't glory, it was a weary, necessary duty. Yet he couldn't ignore the way these women flinched at sudden movement, how some still saluted out of drilled reflex. He kept his distance but tried to keep the camp decent. He'd seen what hatred did, in burned towns and men gone hard from killing. Something in him refused to add to that ledger. Dusty, less guarded, joked and offered gum, a tiny rebellion against war's dehumanization. Once, while distributing rations, he strummed a guitar and sang a slow, sad Spanish ballad. The women fell silent, listening as if to an echo from another universe. Anna closed her eyes, the song's unfamiliar words stirring something tender she thought war had extinguished. Still, mistrust lingered. One afternoon a German officer captured with them tried to assert authority, barking orders at the women to stand straight, to remember their loyalty. Monroe stepped forward quietly but with steel in his voice, removing the man from the group. The act sent a ripple through the prisoners. Here, rank meant little. These Americans would not mirror the hierarchies that had trapped them. For Anna the shift was slow but unstoppable. She had joined the auxiliaries because it was expected, because everyone said the fatherland needed her. Now she stood in mud behind foreign wire, seeing for the first time that the power she'd served was crumbling and that freedom might look different than she'd been told. Yet she was still a captive, her fate unknown. Hope and fear tangled tight. One evening, rain drummed softly on tent canvas as Monroe patrolled the fence. Anna sat nearby, knees drawn to her chest, pretending not to watch him. He paused, looking out at the dark horizon where distant artillery still flashed. After a long silence he said, more to himself than to her, "Almost over." His voice was gentle, heavy with miles of war. She didn't answer, unsure if it was meant for her, but the words sank deep. Almost over. For him, for her, for everything they had known. When he turned and caught her gaze, there was no enmity in his face, only a tired man acknowledging another human being caught in the same storm. It was a moment small enough to vanish into the night, yet for Anna it cracked something open. She realized she was no longer afraid of him. The barbed wire still stood, but the wall inside her was weakening. Across the yard, Dusty coaxed a hesitant laugh from Liesel by showing her how to flick raindrops with a finger snap. The absurdity of it, cowboys teaching tricks in a POW camp, would have seemed impossible months before. But here it was real, undeniable. And beneath the fragile warmth, a deeper question brewed. If everything she'd believed about the enemy could be wrong, what else in the world might be untrue? What would remain when the war ended and the banners of the Reich were gone? Anna lay awake that night, rain tapping like quiet fingers on the tent roof, staring into the dark. Somewhere beyond the wire, men from a faraway land strummed guitars and talked softly of home. She felt the old story of us versus them slipping through her grasp, leaving an uncertain, dangerous freedom in its place, and the first stirring of a truth she was not yet ready to name, came with a fragile, almost eerie quiet. One morning the camp woke to a rumor whispered from tent to tent. Hitler was dead. By nightfall it was confirmed. The Reich had broken at last. The great machine that had swallowed their youth and dictated their fears was suddenly gone, and in its place came an unnerving emptiness. The guards didn't cheer. The prisoners didn't either. Everyone simply absorbed the news like a blow they'd been bracing for but still couldn't quite comprehend. Anna stood near the fence that evening, fingers curled around the rusting wire, eyes fixed on a sky streaked with the pale rose of spring dusk. She had imagined that Germany's fall would feel like defeat, humiliation, or maybe even liberation. Instead it felt like vertigo, the floor of belief vanishing beneath her feet. She thought of her father's lectures about destiny, her commander's cold orders, the rigid world she had obeyed. Now all of it was dust. And across the yard, smoking in quiet contemplation, stood the men who had once been her enemy. They looked neither triumphant nor cruel. Just finished, tired and alive. Jack Monroe had learned long ago not to expect clean endings. Victory was supposed to taste sweet, but to him it felt heavy. Too many empty bunks in his company. Too many memories of faces lost on beaches and hillsides. Yet that night, when he heard the prisoners murmuring about Hitler's death, he felt something strange and unexpected. Relief that had nothing to do with politics. Relief that maybe, finally, the killing might stop. He glanced toward Anna, the silent girl with sharp, watchful eyes. She was staring out at the horizon like someone reading a future she wasn't sure she wanted. He almost called to her, then stopped. Words could so easily fail here. The Americans received orders to prepare for transport. Some prisoners would soon be moved to larger processing centers. Others, especially the women, might be repatriated as the Allied lines advanced deeper into Germany. The war was ending, but its aftershocks were only beginning. Every soldier and every captive carried invisible freight. Grief, shame, confusion, small shards of hope. For Jack, the challenge was new, how to be a keeper of peace after years of destruction. For Anna, the challenge was stranger still, how to imagine a life beyond the doctrine she had once believed absolute. Days grew warmer. The camp's mood shifted, tentative but palpable. There were still fences, but the air felt less charged. Guards and prisoners sometimes exchanged nods. A few ventured halting words. Dusty taught Liesel to count to 10 in English, and she returned the favor in German, both laughing when their tongues tripped. Anna kept more distance, but not out of fear, more out of the sheer strangeness of trusting former enemies. She found herself listening to the Americans' conversations, catching names of places that sounded like songs. Amarillo, Santa Fe, Cheyenne. She pictured the endless skies they described and wondered if such openness could heal a country scarred by walls and borders. One afternoon, Monroe was tasked with escorting a group of prisoners to a nearby depot for supplies. To his mild surprise, Anna was among them. She kept her head down, but her eyes missed nothing. The trucks, the burned-out villages, the farmers tentatively returning to their fields. As they walked, Monroe slowed his long stride to match hers. "You speak English?" he asked, gentle but direct. "A little," she answered cautiously. Her voice was soft but steady. He nodded, impressed. "Your name, Anna, right?" She hesitated, then nodded back. "Ja." They walked in silence a while, the crunch of gravel and distant birdsong filling the gap. Finally Monroe said, "War's over soon. You'll go home." Anna didn't know what home meant anymore. She thought of Berlin's rubble, of her parents if they still lived, of a life built on lies now exposed. "Home is different," she murmured, searching for words. "Everything is gone." Monroe studied her profile, so young and already hollowed by what she'd seen. "Then build new," he said quietly. It wasn't an order, just a possibility spoken aloud. For Anna, the words landed like a spark in dark waters. Build new. Could she? Could anyone? She wanted to ask how, but something in his face, the long miles of fatigue, the quiet steadiness, made her swallow the question. She understood it was not a promise, only an opening. That night she replayed the conversation again and again, the simplicity of it startling her. Build new. She had spent years obeying a system that allowed no newness, only blind loyalty. Now, standing at history's edge, she glimpsed a different horizon, terrifying and free. The end came not with fanfare but with the grinding of trucks. Orders arrived. The women would be moved to a processing station where they'd be registered and eventually released if cleared of war crimes. The Americans assembled them at dawn. Dusty cracked one last joke to ease tension, earning shy smiles. Monroe stood a little apart, scanning the line, protective though no longer required to be. As Anna climbed onto the truck bed, she looked back once. Monroe was there, leaning on his rifle, hat pushed back, watching. Their eyes met. A single, wordless exchange across language and circumstance. Gratitude flickered there, and something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps, or the fragile seed of respect. She lifted her hand in the smallest of waves. He touched the brim of his helmet like a cowboy tipping his hat. Then the truck jolted forward, and the camp receded into mist. The road wound through a Germany unrecognizable. Towns flattened to brick dust, villages hollow with absence, fields littered with abandoned guns. Yet spring dared to return, trees greening, birds cutting through silence. Anna felt the weight of everything lost, but also, impossibly, the first tremor of life beyond loss. She thought of the Americans' easy laughter, their music, the strange dignity in their strength. She thought of Monroe's quiet counsel, build new. She didn't know how to forgive or even if she should, but she knew she could not go back to blind obedience. Something had shifted irrevocably. Monroe watched the trucks disappear until they were nothing but a haze on the horizon. He felt no triumph, only a strange tenderness and an ache he couldn't quite name. The war had turned enemies into faces and faces into lives. He'd spent years breaking through defenses, towns, bunkers, armies, but the hardest wall to breach had been his own. Somewhere in that bleak camp, amid mud and wire, he had glimpsed a young woman finding her own way out of lies. And somehow that felt like a small victory worth carrying home. The following weeks blurred. Berlin fell, Germany surrendered, and the great tide of soldiers began to flow back toward home. Monroe rode trains packed with weary men, listening to talk of ranches and fields and girls waiting back in dusty towns. Dusty slept with his hat over his eyes, dreaming perhaps of cattle trails instead of barbed wire. They would return changed, not just by the battles they'd fought, but by the people they'd met, even those they'd been taught to hate. Anna, too, returned to a Germany in ruins. She found Berlin shattered but alive, its people stunned and searching. Her parents' flat was gone. Her mother survived, her father had vanished in the chaos. Together they scavenged and rebuilt in small, stubborn ways. At night, Anna wrote in a cheap notebook, trying to untangle the past. She wrote of fear and indoctrination, of the night she first saw the Americans, of the moment she realized the enemy could be human. She wrote Monroe's words, build new, like a vow. Years later she would tell her children about that spring, The end of the Reich, the camp, the cowboys who were nothing like the monsters she'd expected. She would describe how one man with tired eyes and a quiet voice shattered a lifetime of propaganda simply by treating her as human. It would become a family story, not of shame alone but of awakening. And Jack Monroe, somewhere in Texas, would tell his grandchildren about the war in a different way than the movies showed it. He'd talk about mud and fear, about losing friends, but also about a German girl who taught him that winning wasn't about breaking enemies, it was about proving that kindness could survive when everything else was gone. Sometimes he'd say victory is not in the taking but in the refusing to hate. Their paths never crossed again, yet the brief intersection remained a turning point neither could forget. In a world drunk on division, they had stumbled upon connection. Fragile, unscripted, profoundly human. The war had begun with lies about enemies and heroes. It ended for them in a moment of quiet recognition across barbed wire. And perhaps that was the most dangerous, beautiful truth of all, that even in history's darkest hours, a single act of decency can fracture an empire of fear.